The veteran thought it was just another snowy night in the mountains of Silver Ridge. A quiet drive through the storm with his little boy, whose right arm was made of wood. Nothing out of the ordinary. Until his old K9 partner Max suddenly barked into the darkness, and he knew something was wrong. Beneath a fallen pine, half buried in snow, they found a cardboard box. Inside it, a newborn baby, her lips blue, her breaths shallow. Beside her lay a soaked note, the handwriting trembling. "Please save her. I can't." He stood frozen. He had carried pain from the past, and now, in the same winter that had once taken everything, fate had placed a fragile heartbeat in his hands. He didn't yet know that the child carried a secret and a truth that would test what little faith he still held in mercy and redemption. Don't look away. Stay with us as we follow this story. A story of loyalty that outlasts the storm, and of a light that never fades, even when the world forgets. Before we begin, please subscribe to Healing with Max and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? I truly wonder how far this story will travel. Night hung over Silver Ridge like a heavy coat no one could take off. The snow didn't fall. It drifted, slow and deliberate, each flake gliding through the dark like ash from an unseen fire. Out on the mountain road, an old pickup truck pushed forward against the wind, its headlights slicing through the white haze. Inside, the hum of the heater struggled against the storm's breath. At the wheel sat Raymond Cole, 55, his shoulders broad but bent slightly with the quiet weight of years. The light from the dashboard drew faint lines across his face, creases carved by war, loss, and long winters. His hands were steady on the wheel, but his eyes had that faraway look of someone who had driven too long with ghosts as passengers. Beside him sat Max, his German shepherd. The dog's muzzle had gone silver with age, his fur dark sable and brown, thick even in the cold. One ear twitched, then the other. His eyes, amber and alive, followed the curtain of snow beyond the windshield, as if listening to something the human world couldn't hear. In the back seat lay a folded blanket, a worn wooden prosthetic arm, and a small figure sleeping beneath a wool coat. Samuel, 8 years old, breathing softly, his head tilted against the window. The stump of his right arm was tucked beneath his coat like a secret he no longer feared. His face, soft, pale, and calm, was lit faintly by the glow of the dashboard. The kind of calm that only children and soldiers after battle know, the kind that comes after too much, has already been taken. Outside, the world was a blur of motionless white. Raymond's eyes flicked toward the mirror, checking Samuel, checking Max, then back to the road. The storm pressed harder, its voice rising, sweeping across the valley like a hymn gone wrong. The wipers groaned, the tires slid once, caught, and carried on. The veteran didn't curse or panic. He simply adjusted the wheel and breathed through it, like he'd done in darker nights on foreign soil. Then came a sound, small, soft, living, not from the truck. Max lifted his head, his ears pricked, nose quivering. A low growl rumbled through his chest, uncertain but alert. Raymond glanced sideways. "What is it, boy?" His voice was calm, but the dog's body had gone still, rigid. Max pressed one paw against the door and whined. Then, with a sharp bark that cut through the storm, he demanded to be heard. Raymond slowed the truck. The headlights caught nothing but swirling snow. The forest on both sides of the road loomed black and deep. He rolled down the window. Wind slapped him in the face, full of ice and silence. And then it came again, faint, high, and trembling. so faint he thought it was the wind whistling through the trees. But Max was already out of the truck, paws crunching through snow, moving toward the woods. Raymond left the engine running. The heater hummed on for Samuel's sake. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped into the storm. The cold hit him like a wall, needles against his skin. But he followed the streak of paw prints vanishing into the pines. The beam of light cut across tree trunks, catching the glint of frost and the ghostly sway of branches. The world was soundless except for the wind. His breath came in white bursts, each one swallowed instantly by the cold. Then, faint again, closer this time, the same cry. Not wind, not an animal, human, he froze. The sound threaded through the trees, thin and broken, like a prayer lost in translation. He followed it, stumbling once on a root hidden under snow. Max barked once, short and urgent. Raymond raised the beam and saw the dog standing still near a fallen pine, its trunk half buried beneath drifts. He reached him. The flashlight trembled slightly in his hand. At the base of the tree, half covered in snow, was a cardboard box, wet, torn, out of place in the wilderness. Raymond's heart hammered once, then steadied. He knelt, brushed away the snow, and pulled the box open with numbed fingers. What he saw inside made the world go quiet. A baby, tiny, fragile, wrapped in a towel stiffened with frost. The child's lips were blue. Her breath was so shallow it barely stirred the air. Her small hands curled into fists against her chest, clutching a piece of paper soaked through with melted snow. Raymond leaned closer, afraid even his breath might steal her last bit of warmth. The words on the paper were smudged, trembling like they'd been written by someone crying, "Please save her." "I can't." He didn't move. He didn't speak. Snowflakes landed on his gloves, melting instantly from the heat of his trembling hands. He had seen death before, too often. But this was something else entirely. This was life clinging to the thinnest edge of mercy. The flashlight beam shook as he slid one arm beneath the tiny body. She weighed almost nothing. Her skin was cold as stone, her heartbeat faint as a whisper. Max pressed close, whining low, ears flat, tail still. The dog's breath misted over the box like a benediction. Raymond looked up at the dark sky. The snow fell slower now, heavy but gentle, each flake settling without sound. It felt like the world had paused to see what he would do next. He held the baby closer, the towel crackling with frost. Somewhere deep in his chest, something long, silent stirred. The ache of memory, the echo of his wife's last breath years ago, the sound of a newborn's cry that never lasted beyond the night. For a moment, everything, the forest, the wind, the snow, seemed to bow in silence. He exhaled, breath unsteady. "Max, get the truck." But Max was already gone, racing back through the snow, guided by instinct and something divine. Raymond stayed kneeling there, the child in his arms, the note fluttering weakly in the wind. The storm had quieted, but his pulse thundered in his ears. The baby stirred just once, and the faintest gasp escaped her lips. A sound so fragile, it could have shattered the world. He pressed her gently against his chest, wrapping her inside his coat. The warmth from his body met the chill of her skin, and for 1 second, just one, the rhythm of their hearts seemed to align. The light from the flashlight fell across the snow, catching Max's paw prints leading back to the road, a perfect trail through the dark. Raymond rose slowly, each movement careful, reverent, as if he were carrying not a child, but a piece of heaven's forgiveness. Behind him, the forest sighed, A long, low groan of wood shifting under ice, or maybe something older than sound itself. Ahead, through the trees, he could see the faint orange glow of the truck's headlights cutting through the gray. He began to walk. Each step crunched softly, his boots sinking deep, his breath coming in white clouds that rose and vanished. The child's weight against his chest felt impossibly light, yet heavier than any burden he'd carried before. When he reached the truck, Max was waiting by the open door, chest heaving, eyes bright. Raymond laid the baby gently across the blanket in the passenger seat. The heater's warm air reached them both. Steam rose from his coat as melting snow darkened the fabric. He touched the child's tiny hand. It was cold, but not lifeless. The faint pulse trembled beneath his fingertip like the flicker of a candle that refused to die. Raymond's face, lit by the glow of the dashboard, softened for the first time in years. Something in him broke and healed all at once. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft, endless, forgiving. Inside the truck, the world grew still, as if heaven itself was holding its breath. The glass doors of Lakeside Memorial burst open to the sound of boots hitting tile and wind howling behind them. Raymond Cole stumbled inside, his coat heavy with melted snow, arms locked around the small, frozen bundle pressed against his chest. The cold still clung to him like a second skin, but it was not the storm that had carved the color from his face. It was fear, the kind that comes when you've already lost once and swore you never would again. Fluorescent lights burned too bright. Voices collided in panic. Someone shouted for a stretcher, for blankets, for oxygen. But the world narrowed to the small, unmoving face beneath the towel. The stillness of her lips was the same as that night years ago, the night his wife's breath had vanished between two heartbeats. For a second, Raymond felt that same terrible silence blooming again, a silence that seemed to say he'd been too late. Again. Behind him, the automatic doors gasped open once more. A boy stepped through, small, trembling, a leash wound tight around his good hand. Samuel blinked at the sterile brightness, snow melting into the seams of his worn boots. The dog at his side, Max, loyal and gray around the muzzle, stood tall and motionless, as though he too understood that this moment held no room for sound. "Dad?" came the whisper. Raymond turned just enough to meet his son's eyes. Words were too heavy to lift, but the gesture said enough. "Stay with him." Samuel nodded, clutching Max's fur as his father disappeared into a flurry of nurses. The child was placed beneath the glow of a heating lamp. The air hummed with the fragile rhythm of machines, the kind of sound that feels like hope pretending not to die. A nurse peeled away the towel, fingers trembling as she counted breaths that came too slow, too shallow. The monitors beeped, once, twice, again, hesitant, like a heart learning to trust itself. Standing at the edge of the chaos was Dr. Lena Carver, the town's only on-call physician that night. She was in her 40s, hair pulled back beneath a knit cap, face lined with exhaustion more from years of small-town duty than age itself. Her scrubs were faded, her hands steady. In her eyes flickered something rare. Not disbelief, not pity, but the calm of someone who'd stared down death often enough to know that sometimes it blinks first. "You found her out there?" she asked, voice quiet but sure. Raymond only nodded. His lips moved, but no sound came. Dr. Carver met his gaze, then looked down at the child. "Then she's got a chance," she murmured. It wasn't a promise. It was permission for the man who'd forgotten how to hope to start remembering again. From the hallway, Max sat sentinel beside Samuel, his body still, his gaze fixed through the glass. His reflection shimmered on the pane. Two dogs, one real, one ghost, watching over something both ancient and new. The boy pressed his wooden arm against the cold surface, the tap-tap barely audible over the beeping monitors. "She's so small," he whispered, not sure if anyone heard. Hours blurred. Nurses rotated in weary rhythm. The clock hands crawled, each minute stretching like a lifetime. Outside, the storm softened. Snow no longer screamed but sighed, falling in slow surrender. Inside, the heater hummed, turning the sterile air thick and warm. Raymond never sat. He stood near the wall, as if afraid his weight might break the fragile line between life and loss. His clothes steamed under the vent, the scent of wet wool and metal filling the small room. His hands, blistered from the cold, flexed and stilled again and again. He had faced gunfire, deserts, and nights without stars. But this, watching a tiny chest fight for breath, this was the hardest battle yet. Dr. Carver adjusted the IV, her brow furrowed but calm. "She's strong," she said softly, almost to herself. "She's trying." Then it came, faint, wavering, almost unsure of itself. A cry, a small, cracked sound that made every head in the room lift. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. It was the sound of defiance, of life refusing to be buried beneath the snow. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the room exhaled all at once, laughter, tears, sighs blending into one trembling chorus of relief. The nurse covered her mouth. Dr. Carver's shoulders eased. Raymond staggered backward until the wall caught him. His knees bent, and he slid down slowly, palms over his face. When his hands fell away, tears had carved clean streaks down the dirt and salt crusting his skin. The kind of tears that don't belong to weakness, but to a man remembering what grace feels like after too many winters without it. Outside the window, dawn was coming, not golden, not radiant, but gray and forgiving. The kind of light that promises nothing except another chance. The door creaked softly. Samuel stood there, his hair damp, cheeks red from sleep. He crossed the room, his small wooden arm resting against his father's shoulder. The gesture was light, almost unsure, but it was all the courage a child could give. "Dad," he said, barely above a breath. "Maybe God wanted us to find her." Raymond didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat worked, but no sound came. Instead, his trembling hand found his son's, small, warm, and whole in all the ways that mattered. He held on, not to answer, but to agree. In the hallway, Max turned his head toward the window, where the first light of morning spilled across the snow. He gave one slow wag of his tail, as though confirming something unspoken. That sometimes, heaven doesn't send angels with wings, but with scars and paws and hands that still know how to hold. By the time the storm withdrew back into the mountains, the town of Silver Ridge had found its rhythm again. Slow, cautious, marked by the creak of porch boards and the hiss of coffee poured into chipped mugs. But inside the cabin near the edge of the valley, time moved differently. Days blurred into weeks, the kind that carried both healing and weight. The baby survived. Her lungs, once too weak for the world, now filled the room with fragile laughter. Raymond called her Grace, because that's what she was, a mercy he hadn't earned but had been given anyway. In the mornings, light filtered through frost-streaked glass, touching the small cradle Samuel had helped build out of pine scraps. The boy would stand beside it, wooden arm resting on the edge, whispering things only a child could think to say. Max lay nearby, head on paws, eyes always open, guarding something too sacred to name. Raymond watched them from the table, a quiet pride tangled with disbelief. It had been years since his home had known warmth that wasn't made of fire. Yet amid the sound of tiny breaths and the scent of milk warming on the stove, one thing would not leave him: the note. The paper had dried, but its words still trembled in his mind. Please save her. I can't. He'd read it so many times that the lines seemed to breathe, as though whoever wrote them was still waiting to be heard. The handwriting was delicate, looping, almost apologetic. A woman's hand, desperate and unsure. Raymond folded it again, slower this time, and placed it inside the breast pocket of his flannel shirt, next to his heart, as if hoping proximity might give him peace. But peace never came. On the third Sunday after the rescue, he drove into town, the kind of gray morning when snow hadn't yet decided whether to fall or to forgive. Silver Ridge looked almost kind under its layer of quiet. Smoke rising from chimneys, the diner lights blinking against the fog. Raymond parked by the sheriff's office, stepped out, and was greeted by the familiar scrape of boots on wood. Sheriff Walt Danner appeared at the doorway, a man in his 60s, round-faced but sharp-eyed, with a mustache the color of old snow. His uniform fit like a memory, creased, faded, too comfortable to be official. He was cleaning his glasses when he saw Raymond, and for a moment, his expression softened the way men do when they see a ghost they once shared a war with. "Ray," he said simply, then nodded toward the office. Inside, the room smelled of stale coffee and the faint trace of gun oil. Files lay open like forgotten prayers. Raymond reached into his pocket and pulled out the note, laying it on the desk between them. It looked smaller here under the harsh light, but somehow heavier. Walt squinted, leaning close. "This paper's cheap," he muttered, dragging a calloused thumb across the edge. "But the ink, see that shine? That's high-grade gel ink. Only place around here that sells it is the University Bookstore." Raymond's brows drew together. "You think the mother's from there?" Walt leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "Could be. Or someone who wanted it to look that way." The clock ticked, the kind of sound that swells when no one knows what to say next. Raymond looked at the note again, its letters glinting faintly under the light, as if mocking him with half a truth. He folded it once more, tucking it back into his pocket. The gesture slower this time, like a soldier sheathing a weapon he doesn't want to use. When he stepped back outside, the afternoon had dimmed. Snow began to fall again, lazy at first, then thick. The street was nearly empty, save for a woman crossing in the distance, head down, a scarf drawn tight against the wind. For a brief second, something in the slope of her shoulders tugged at him, a familiarity he couldn't name. Then she was gone, swallowed by white. That night, the cabin glowed soft with firelight. Samuel slept in the loft, curled under a quilt, his breathing steady and even. Grace dreamed in her cradle, the tiny rise and fall of her chest almost lost beneath the crackle of logs. Raymond sat by the hearth, elbows on his knees, the folded note before him on the table. Max lay at his feet, eyes following the shifting flame. Outside, the wind prowled through the trees, patient and cold. Raymond picked up the note. His thumb traced the letters like a man reading a wound. He reached into his pocket for the lighter he'd carried since service, a scratched brass thing engraved with a unit number that no longer existed. He flicked it once, twice. The flame rose, small and trembling. He held it close to the paper. Heat licked the edge, but the ink caught the light instead of fire. He hesitated. The letters seemed to move, soft and pleading, as if the voice that wrote them was asking for one more chance to be known. The lighter clicked shut. The room dimmed. Max lifted his head, ears twitching. Raymond exhaled, long and heavy. "Can't do it, boy," he whispered, voice rasped by years and ghosts. Max's tail brushed the floor once, a sound that might have meant understanding. The fire burned lower, embers pulsing like slow heartbeats. Raymond leaned back, eyes half closed, and thought of the woman who'd written those words. The tremor in her hand, the cold that must have surrounded her. Whoever she was, she hadn't meant to abandon, only to save. The thought didn't comfort him. It unsettled him more, because mercy, when undeserved, often asks for something in return. When dawn came, pale and thin, he was already up. The world outside was washed in silver, the kind of light that doesn't warm but guides. Samuel stirred, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his hair sticking up in a dozen directions. "Are you going somewhere, Dad?" Raymond zipped his coat, checked the map on the counter, and glanced at the note lying folded beside it. "Yeah," he said softly, "just for a bit." Samuel nodded, still half dreaming. "Take Max." Raymond smiled faintly. "Always." By the time he stepped outside, Max was already waiting by the truck, breath puffing white into the air. Raymond tucked the note back into his pocket, close to the heart that had kept him alive long enough to wonder again. The engine turned over. The road ahead curved toward the valley, where snow fell in sheets like curtain lace. Behind them, the cabin shrank to a dot of warmth against the wilderness. Ahead, somewhere past the hills and the frozen lake, the university waited, its towers half buried in mist, carrying secrets that never quite froze to death. Raymond's hands tightened on the wheel. "Come on, Max," he murmured. "Let's find the truth." The German shepherd barked once, sharp and clear, the sound echoing through the valley like a vow that would not fade. Snow whispered against the windshield, as Raymond's truck wound through the narrow back roads that stitched the edge of town to the frozen hills beyond. The light was thin and gray, the kind of morning that carried no sound but the hum of the engine and the slow, rhythmic breathing of Max at his side. The note sat folded on the dashboard, trembling each time the wipers swept across the glass. Every few miles, Raymond's eyes flicked toward it, not because he needed to, but because it had become the compass for something larger than reason, something he still couldn't name. The road ended at a slope where the trees grew thick and the snow deepened. Ahead, half buried in drifts, stood a small cabin, its roof sagging, its chimney cracked, a place that looked as if the world had chosen to forget it. Smoke no longer rose from the flue. Only the faint trace of footprints broke the white silence leading to its door. Raymond cut the engine. The sound of it dying filled the air with stillness. He stepped out, his boots sinking deep. The air was sharp, clean, and empty. Max leapt down beside him, landing softly, ears alert. Together they approached the door. Raymond hesitated a moment, then knocked once. Firm, deliberate, not unkind. For a heartbeat, there was no answer. Then a sound. The shuffle of feet, a rustle of fabric, the click of a latch. The door creaked open just enough for a face to appear. Young, pale, framed by hair the color of wheat left too long in winter. Her eyes were wide and sleepless, shadowed by nights that had forgotten mercy. Megan Ward, 23 years old. The kind of name that once belonged to campus rosters and poetry journals, not to isolation and fear. She wore a heavy sweater several sizes too large, sleeves hanging past trembling fingers. her breath fogged in the cold between them. Raymond removed his glove, reached into his coat, and pulled out the note. He unfolded it silently and held it toward her. The words caught the light like scars. Her gaze fell on the page, and color drained from her face. She gripped the doorframe to steady herself. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked like ice splitting on a lake. "I didn't mean for her to die," she whispered. "I waited in the woods for hours. I just wanted someone, anyone, to find her." The air thickened, the world narrowing to the sound of her confession. Her words came uneven, gasping, as if each one cost more breath than she had to spare. And once they began, she couldn't stop them, like water spilling from a cracked jar. She told him about the professor, a man older, admired, the kind whose words could wrap around a person until they mistook them for warmth. She'd been studying literature at the university, dreaming of writing, of teaching, of a future with more light than fear. But when she told him she was pregnant, his eyes had turned cold, his voice careful. By the end of that week, he was gone. The shame followed faster than the snow. Friends whispered, professors avoided her name. Her parents, good people once proud, closed their doors and sent her silence instead of shelter. She had nowhere to go, no one to call. So she went north, into the woods, toward the sound of wind in the pines. She thought she'd rest for a night. She thought she'd find courage again come morning. But the baby came early. The pain was too much. She bled, she prayed, she fainted and woke again to the sound of her child's cry and the cold closing in. Her eyes filled now, but she didn't wipe the tears. I wrapped her in the only thing I had. I thought if I stayed too long, we'd both die. I waited. I waited until I couldn't feel my hands. I left her where someone might find her. Then I crawled away. I thought I was dying. Raymond said nothing. The lines of his face stayed hard, but something in his eyes shifted, like a man who'd once stood at that same edge between survival and surrender. The wind outside moaned through the eaves. Inside, time bent itself around the weight of her words. Max stepped forward, slow and deliberate, his paws soundless on the wooden floor. He stopped beside her, looking up, head tilted. Then, as if understanding something no one else could, he pressed his muzzle gently against her knee. That was when she broke, the kind of breaking that isn't loud or sudden but quiet and complete. Her shoulders trembled, her fingers curled in the fur at his neck. Raymond watched, motionless. There were no words fit for such moments, only silence, shared and heavy, that somehow carried grace within it. When she finally looked up, her face was streaked but calm. She met his gaze not as a child seeking forgiveness, but as a soul who had already sentenced herself. Raymond rose, his boots creaking against the floor. "You'll come with me," he said quietly. His voice was neither stern nor soft, only certain. "No one's here to hurt you, but it's time to stop running." She stared at him, as if unsure whether to believe it. Then slowly, she nodded. He stepped aside to let her gather her things: a worn coat, a satchel, a notebook she clutched to her chest as though it were her last defense. Max waited by the door, tail low, watchful. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, fine, weightless flakes drifting down through the gray morning light. As they stepped into it, the sound of their boots was muffled, each step sinking into something soft, forgiving. The cabin behind them disappeared quickly, its outline swallowed by the storm. Megan paused once, glancing back, not in regret, but in farewell to the version of herself that had lived there. Raymond stood beside her, the wind catching in his coat, the note still tucked inside his pocket like a heartbeat. He looked out over the valley, where the horizon bled into the pale sky. Something turned in his memory then, a name, half buried but not lost. The professor. He remembered a letterhead, a handshake years ago during his military outreach work. And with that memory came a cold clarity. He knew who the man was. The wind pressed against them, carrying flakes that melted as they touched skin. Max barked once, a low, distant echo swallowed by snow. The storm wasn't angry this time. It was quiet, almost gentle, as if the sky itself was learning how to forgive. Morning came slowly, wrapped in a gray hush that dulled the horizon. Raymond's truck rumbled along the narrow road back toward Silver Ridge, its tires cutting dark grooves through slush and ice. The heater coughed weakly, spreading uneven warmth that smelled faintly of rust and old wool. Megan sat beside him, pale and motionless, her eyes lost in the blur of passing pines. Max lay on the floorboard between them, his fur dusted with melting snow, head pressed against Raymond's boot. Each mile passed like a heartbeat that had forgotten how to hurry. The town appeared at last, small, tired, and honest under the weight of its own winter. Smoke drifted from chimneys, slow and gray, rising into a sky that couldn't decide between storm and sunlight. Raymond parked behind the sheriff's office. He cut the engine, the sudden quiet so complete it felt like the air itself was listening. Megan held the phone in her lap, trembling. On its cracked screen glowed the single word that had broken her world open again: proof. Inside, Sheriff Walt Danner looked older than he had a week ago. His uniform was rumpled, his eyes lined with sleeplessness, but his handshake was firm. Raymond placed the phone and the flash drive on the desk without a word. The sheriff nodded once, then fed them into the aging computer. The room filled with the hum of spinning data. One file opened, then another. Emails, recordings, screenshots, words that sounded polished when written, now exposed as cowardice in ink, and then the recording. Whitmore's voice, smooth, commanding, soaked in cruelty. If anyone finds out, you're done. Do what you must. End it. The sound seemed to freeze the air. Megan turned away, her hand pressed to her mouth, shoulders shaking. The sheriff leaned back, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Raymond didn't move. He stared at the screen until his reflection blurred with the waveforms pulsing across it. That voice, it carried the same tone he'd once heard on battlefields and in debriefing rooms. Men with medals who made monsters of others, then called it leadership. By noon, the storm clouds had begun to thin. The town's streets stirred with whispers. Raymond walked across the university courtyard with Max at his side, the veteran's steps slow, deliberate, like a man who carried the weight of both judgment and mercy. Students crossed paths around him, their laughter ringing across the frozen campus, unbothered by the ghosts walking among them. For a moment, Raymond looked at their bright faces and thought of Megan, how once she must have walked here, head full of poems and futures that never arrived. The building loomed ahead, tall and hollow, the kind that smelled of dust and pride. Whitmore's office sat at the end of a narrow hallway lined with portraits of donors and old scholars. The brass nameplate on the door gleamed under the flicker of fluorescent light. Raymond knocked once. The professor looked up, startled. He was a man in his 50s, silver hair trimmed short, tailored jacket, the kind of smile that had convinced too many people for too long. "Mr. Cole," he said smoothly, "I heard you've been asking questions. If this is about that girl, I assure you—" But Raymond had already set the phone on the desk. A single tap. The recording filled the air like smoke. The professor's voice echoed back at him. The same tone, same words, now stripped of power. The blinds cut the light into narrow bars across his face. Sweat glistened at his temple. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his hands twitching toward a drawer that no longer offered safety. Raymond's shadow stretched across the floor, steady and silent. "You left her to die," he said finally, the words rough as gravel. "But she lived. And now everyone will know why." The silence afterward was so deep it felt holy. Outside, snow began to fall again, small flakes that landed softly on the window ledge, melting into the glass like tears. When the sheriff arrived minutes later, Whitmore didn't fight. His words had already condemned him. The handcuffs clicked, a small metallic sound swallowed by the hush of the room. Students gathered near the doorway, their faces pale with disbelief. Some whispered, others simply stared, as if watching the collapse of something they'd once trusted. By dusk, Silver Ridge was alive with murmurs, on radios, in diners, through the buzz of television screens. The story spread fast. A professor exposed, a student's truth reclaimed, a child saved by chance and by grace. But Raymond didn't stay to hear it. Justice wasn't something he celebrated anymore. It always came too late and never returned what had been taken. He drove to the hospital instead. The roads were quiet, the snowfall gentle now, as if the world itself had exhaled. Lakeside Memorial glowed against the night, a beacon of warmth in a valley of frost. The corridors hummed softly with machines and footsteps muffled by linoleum. Megan stood at the nursery window, her reflection framed in glass and lamplight. Inside, under the golden warmth of the heater, Grace slept, small fists curled beside her face. Megan reached out, fingertips trembling as they touched the glass. For the first time, her tears didn't come from guilt, but from awe. Samuel stood beside Raymond, the boy's small wooden arm resting lightly on the sill. Max leaned his head against it, eyes half closed, tail flicking once, then still. Raymond watched Megan, and in her shaking shoulders he saw something familiar. The same weight he'd carried since the day he lost his wife. The same impossible question of why one life ends and another is spared. He took a slow breath. "Sometimes," he said softly, not looking at anyone, "we don't save people. We just give them a chance to save themselves." The words hung there, fragile, luminous, before settling like snow. Megan didn't turn, but her hand pressed harder to the glass, as if trying to bridge the space between what was and what might still be forgiven. Grace stirred in her sleep, tiny fingers stretching toward the faint outline of her mother's palm. For a moment, it seemed as if all four of them, the soldier, the mother, the child, and the dog, were bound together by that single breath between sorrow and mercy. Samuel smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried more understanding than his years should allow. He whispered something to Max, and the dog gave a low, contented rumble as though agreeing that the night, for once, had done no harm. The heater hummed on. The clock ticked softly. And outside, Silver Ridge lay beneath a fresh quilt of snow, every rooftop and pine branch shimmering under the faint glow of the street lamps. In a town that had seen too many winters, people would speak of this night in quiet tones, not as a scandal or a crime, but as a story of the moment mercy outweighed shame. A story about a veteran who didn't look away, a mother who faced what she feared, and a little girl who carried their forgiveness in the steady rhythm of her breath. And when dawn finally touched the mountains, it found Raymond standing at the hospital doors with Max at his side, the cold wind brushing against his face. He looked toward the horizon, the same colorless line where night gave way to light, and let his eyes close. For the first time in years, he wasn't searching for what he'd lost. He was grateful for what had been found. Spring arrived in Silver Ridge quietly, like someone afraid to wake the sleeping mountains. The snow melted in slow sighs, slipping from the roofs and dripping down gutters until the earth began to smell alive again. Pine branches shook off their frost, and the river at the valley's edge stirred, whispering its thawing secrets. The world, once buried in white silence, was learning how to breathe again. The cabin that had known so much stillness had changed too. The air inside now carried warmth, a rhythm of small sounds, soft laughter, the pages of a book turning, the thud of a wooden toy on the floor. Grace slept in a small crib near the window, her tiny fingers curled around the edge of a wool blanket. Beside her sat Samuel, reading in a slow, patient voice, tracing the words with his left hand while his wooden arm rested across his knees. Each word was imperfect, but each syllable seemed to fill the room with purpose. Max lay at his feet, chest rising and falling in a steady beat, tail twitching every time Samuel misread a word, as if the old dog found joy in the effort itself. The light spilling through the window touched them all in gold, catching the dust in the air like little motes of grace. Raymond moved quietly around them, setting another log into the stove, listening more than speaking. It was a habit he'd learned in war and carried into peace, the knowing that silence can say more than words ever could. His face, once stern and worn from years of solitude, had softened. The lines of grief were still there, but they'd begun to fade beneath something gentler. When Samuel laughed, when Grace stirred in her sleep, when Max sighed as if content to simply exist, Raymond felt the quiet kind of gratitude that didn't need a name. That morning, the sun rose clear and strong. Dew shimmered along the porch rail, and from somewhere deep in the trees, a meadowlark began to sing. Raymond stepped outside to stack firewood when he heard it, a sound not of the forest, but of a human heart finding courage. A knock, he turned, and there she was. Megan stood at the bottom of the steps, wrapped in a simple blue coat that caught the light of early spring. Her hair was loose, lifted by the wind, and in her hands she carried a small bundle of wildflowers, violet, white, and yellow, the first to bloom through the last crusts of snow. Her boots were wet, her breath shallow, but her eyes, those eyes that once drowned in fear, held a steadiness new and fragile, like dawn itself. The road behind her glistened with meltwater, the path she had walked alone. Every step had been an act of forgiveness, not from the world, but from herself. Raymond didn't speak at first. He just opened the screen door, the hinges sighing in welcome. "She's inside," he said quietly, and stepped aside. Megan entered, the scent of pine and warmth enveloping her. Her hands trembled as she moved toward the crib, toward the little life she had believed gone. Grace was awake, cooing softly, her small hand reaching for the light falling through the window. For a long, impossible second, Megan froze. Then her knees gave out. The flowers slipped from her grasp and landed soundlessly on the wooden floor. She sank beside the crib, breath catching, tears spilling unchecked. Grace reached out, tiny fingers tangling in her mother's hair, And in that simple gesture, all the distance between loss and redemption vanished. Samuel looked up from where he sat with Max. His eyes, bright with curiosity, shifted between the two women, the one who had brought the baby into the world and the one his father had carried back from the snow. He turned to Raymond, voice small but sure. "Can she stay?" Raymond's answer came softly, almost like a prayer. "Yes, son," he said, his gaze never leaving them. "She can stay." The day stretched open after that, wide and kind. Megan moved quietly through the house, helping where she could, her touch still unsure but sincere. Samuel showed her his books, proudly explaining how Max always listened even when he stumbled. Raymond brewed coffee and said little, though sometimes his eyes lingered on Megan with a mixture of understanding and something deeper, a shared knowledge of what it means to survive yourself. By evening, the sky had turned the color of warm honey. The four of them sat together on the porch, the veteran, the boy, the mother, and the child, with Max stretched out at their feet. The valley spread before them, painted gold by the setting sun. Snow still lingered in the shadows of the pines, but even that looked softer now, touched by warmth. Samuel leaned against his father's arm, his head resting just below Raymond's shoulder. Megan hummed a faint lullaby, one she hadn't sung since before the world broke. Grace slept in her arms, the light flickering across her cheek like a blessing. Max lifted his head once, nudged Raymond's hand, and licked it just once before setting his muzzle down again. Raymond smiled. "Good job, Max," he murmured. "You brought her home." The dog's tail thumped against the boards, slow and content. The sound was small, but in that stillness it carried farther than thunder. The light dimmed by degrees. The first stars appeared, hesitant and bright. The last streaks of sun slipped behind the ridge, setting the sky on fire before surrendering to dusk. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, alive, sacred. The kind of silence that exists only when the world has been set right again, if only for a while. A breeze swept across the porch, stirring the fallen wildflowers at Megan's feet. Their petals danced, catching the glow of the fading day before settling again in peace. Somewhere in the field beyond, the first fireflies blinked awake, like tiny souls remembering they were meant to shine. In that gentle twilight, everything found its place. The man who had carried too much pain, the woman who had carried too much shame, the boy who carried hope in the space where his hand once was, the dog who had carried them all through the storm, and the child who would carry their light into the years ahead. And perhaps that was the truest form of salvation, not the grand, miraculous kind, but the quiet one, where love chooses to stay even after the storm has passed. Because sometimes the light doesn't come to rescue us, it comes to remain. And in Silver Ridge, beneath the whispering pines, that light stayed. There are moments in life that never make a sound. No applause, no headlines, just the quiet rhythm of someone choosing kindness when no one is watching. Maybe that's what grace really is. The small mercies that hold this world together when everything else seems to fall apart. Some people fight wars we'll never see. Others heal quietly, carrying their scars like lanterns through the dark, showing the rest of us the way home. And sometimes, it's not strength that saves us, but gentleness. Not noise, but presence. If you listen closely, you can still hear them. The loyal ones, the brave ones, the silent guardians who ask for nothing except to keep faith alive a little longer. They remind us that hope doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it just stays, in the warmth of a home, in a loyal friend's watchful eyes, in the simple act of love that refuses to give up. Not every hero wears a badge, and not every story makes the headlines. Here at Healing with Max, we keep their courage alive. Subscribe today, so you'll never miss the next untold story of veterans and their Max partners.